5 coffins ready.
Hey everyone, welcome to my guide for Chronos. Chronos is a mage ADC in SMITE who has significantly high power scaling on, well, just about everything, meaning that he starts off slow but gets incredibly strong as the match progresses. Despite being a mage ADC, he can go both the ADC role and the mid role, but right now he's seen mostly in the mid lane. Part of why is because the most viable build on him at the moment. Full mage Chronos is the most common build thanks to that power scaling, plus the fact that attack speed items just got nerfed very hard, so at the moment, just go full mage, but if you find yourself building an attack speed item, it's probably going to feel just fine. Relics just beats an Aegis as you'd expect on a mage, but Blink has one niche usage on Chronos that I'll touch on later. Shard-wise, well, Wing Shard is great of course, but on Chronos since he's a true mage ADC, Horn Shard is very good on him too, it's just personal preference. Let's get to scaling, the guy, with Chronos' passive. Every 1.5 minutes, Chronos gains 5 magical power, stacking up to 25 times, meaning he can have an extra 125 power at 37.5 minutes into the game. So this passive doesn't really matter. Now don't get me wrong, it definitely makes a difference in the late game, but it's not really something you actively watch over or play around or anything. It's not like you're gonna call, guys, I got my power coming in 10 seconds, let's go! It just doesn't have that big of an impact in the short term like that, but it does ensure that sticking games out with Chronos becomes a little more rewarding than it otherwise would be. Chronos only has 2 damaging abilities, but their power scaling is off the charts high, so this passive fits him like a glove. One such ability, of course, is his first ability. After a short delay, Chronos slams down a small circular AoE that does damage, and he can use this ability over walls. And that's about it. It's tied with Vahmen's second ability as the most simple ability in the game, but it's still extremely effective and important. Generally, you want to spam this ability as much as you can in one of 2 ways. One, you of course want to use it for wave suppression, and the cooldown is short enough that you can keep up with most enemies' wave clear by just hitting the wave over and over again. But secondly, Chronos can use this ability as consistent poke and harass against his lane opponent. So in short, get good at hitting this ability. Like, really good. It's very important to hit this ability like all the time, so get the timing down so you're able to hit the ability every time, because it's not the easiest ability in the game to hit with that wind up time. Other than that though, the ability doesn't get more complex than that. Use it all the time, but make sure you're gonna hit it. And of course, don't stick your neck out too far just to poke with this ability. Spoiler warning here, but Chronos gets ganked and jumped on very easily, so you have to be properly careful about walking up too far against any lane opponent. Far more complex than his first is Chronos' second ability. You may have noticed this clock spinning in Chronos' passive bar. This is actually tied to his second ability. When Chronos activates his second ability, he gains ramping movement speed and a base attack speed for a whopping 7 seconds, and then a third bonus on top of that depending on where the clock hand was when the ability was activated. The first sector grants Chronos a heal for 1% of his maximum health every second, meaning he heals for 7% of his health over the duration. The second sector essentially refunds Chronos the mana he uses on any abilities while the second ability is active, so you spam abilities for 7 seconds and have it cost no mana essentially. Other than the mana you spent on the second ability of course. His third sector grants him 35% bonus magical power for the duration, and yes, this is absolutely ridiculous late game. The fourth and final sector grants 35% bonus magical power scaling on his basic attack, so think of it like Soul's passive but on steroids. And also, keep in mind, mages have a significantly lower amount of power scaling on their basic attacks, so this sort of evens the playing field for him. Quite complicated, so let's firstly break down how you want to use this ability. You essentially cannot fight as Chronos without using this ability, since he's so dependent on the bonuses it grants at every stage of the game. This is part of why the duration is so long, since you sometimes have to use this ability early so you hit the right section for each situation. And let's touch on when you want to use it. You typically want to save it for when you're going to fight, but given that 2 sections are centered around sustain, i.e. health and mana sustain, you want to use it sometimes in those dull downtime moments too. This is typically with that first section which heals you. You need to be sure that the coast is very clear, so use that one when you have some downtime and could use some HP, but use it sparingly. As for the second section, just don't bother outside of the early game. You're going to save yourself a lot of mana in the early game because you basically have to use your first and third abilities to clear the wave effectively, but then after that you can pretty much forget about it. Then come the third and fourth sections. The fourth section is the one you're going to want to use most of the time, until you reach your 5th or 6th item. Essentially, until you reach that very late game situation, it's always more damage overall to put that power into your basic attacks. Then, once your power gets ridiculously high, and you purchase the still very potent Polynomicon, when fighting gods it's much better just to use the third section for the % bonus magical power. As you saw in the intro, it makes Chronos' abilities in that Polynomicon completely annihilate health bars. Note how I said when fighting gods though, since against objectives like Fire Giant and Gold Fury, and when hitting structures like towers and phoenixes, you want to stick with that 4th section for the entirety of the game. Again, since in extended trades, like the ones you'd be taking in the early and mid game, it's best to have that bonus damage on your basic attacks, because it's not just like you can one-shot things like Fire Giant or Gold Fury or towers like I did that Neath in the intro. When to use it as a general idea isn't hard to understand at all. Use it whenever you're about to fight, and that's that, making sure not to be too trigger happy since again, Chronos without this ability is very weak. It can be a bit more tricky thanks to that little clock though. There's going to be plenty of times where you want to use your 2, but you can't because the clock is in the wrong position. And to be honest, it's always a good idea to just wait for the clock hand to reach the correct position before using the ability. So walk up and pretend to be useful for a bit until the clock hand reaches the section you want for that particular scenario. Walking up was also a good idea thanks to Chronos' 3rd ability. Chronos fires a projectile which passes through all enemies and walls. It deals damage in slows and slows attack speed upon contacting an enemy. Then after half a second, they are stunned for a full second. And man, this ability deals damage. But that's obviously not what this ability is good for. It's all about that stun, especially considering how large it is and how it comes straight out of Chronos' face. This makes it extraordinarily good self-peel for Chronos and makes him genuinely difficult to jump on in the early and mid game. Late game, of course, you just need one brave soul to bait this ability out for the team, but in the early and mid game, this is a great tool to keep in your pocket to easily thwart any dive attempts on you. That said, you have to use this ability eventually for damage, and this of course is when Chronos gets opened up to being very easily jumped on, so unlike his first ability, don't spam this one. You have to use it to clear in the early levels to keep up with the enemy mid laner, but you don't really have to use it after you get your first item, so you shouldn't. So in short, save this ability for when you know you can get aggressive onto an enemy and get a kill, or for when you know you need it for self-peel. This is, however, again, where Polynomicon and, as I mentioned at the start, Blink come into play. Since the projectile is so slow and frankly it is hard to hit, doing it in people's faces makes it a lot easier. So 3rd section of your 2, Blink, 3, Basic, 1, and goodbye. You definitely have to get lucky in the sense that they don't just, have their monitors on and beats ages this combo, but fear not, your ultimate can actually help you keep this silly combo safe. Chronos becomes CC immune and winds up for 1 second. During this short wind up, he can take no actions and is susceptible to damage still. He then rewinds himself for another second, and while in this state, he is completely immune to damage and CC. He is placed in the exact spot he was 8 seconds ago when the rewind ends, and he has all of his cooldowns reset regardless of how long or short they were. Also, his health and mana are reset to where they were 8 seconds ago. So obviously, an insane ability with tons of potential, but like Soul last time, has very obvious flaws that the enemy can exploit. First and foremost, you only sort of have control over where you're going to land. Naturally, you can constantly keep moving as Chronos in and out of safe and unsafe positions to give yourself a better chance of landing in a safe spot if you ever need to use this ultimate. But at the end of the day, you're landing where you're landing and that's that. So even though you can plan around giving yourself a half decent spot to rewind to with his ultimate, it's absolutely not up to you when you use his ultimate. As I've mentioned before, Chronos can and will be collapsed on very easily, so he absolutely needs to use this ability to save himself from the inevitable easy death. Timing this is similar to timing your Aegis relic on most gods, but keep in mind you can be damaged during that initial windup, so do it a bit earlier than you would on, say, an Aegis. But not too early, as I'm sure you can imagine, Chronos without his ultimate is basically a free kill. So my number one tip would be to not be too trigger happy with the ability, and use it only when you really need to, but ensure that you're always ready to expend it and don't play too cautious on Chronos in an attempt to hold on to this ability, since in most situations it's better to get involved in the fight and use this ability to avoid important enemy abilities and then continue the fight, rather than be so far back that they never even expend abilities on you in the first place since you're not a threat, and you can easily lose your team to fight that way, and then you have to walk away in shame after your entire team dies. The part about continuing the fight is just as important too. Getting all of your abilities back is absolutely massive, as is getting your health back of course. So just like with your cooldowns and health, reset your mentality as well to remind yourself that you're basically going into the fight fresh again. A lot of hypotheticals and theorizing on this one. My apologies, but it just comes with the nature of the ability. Let's get to the raw mechanical stuff with some combos. 3, basic, 1. 1, 3, basics, 1 again. 3, basic, 2, basics, 1. 2 on the third section, 3, basic, 1, ult, 2 again, 3, basic, 1. And of course, 2 on the third section, 3, basic, 1. For ability leveling, you want your 1 at level 1, your 3 at level 2, and get your 2 at level 3. Getting your 1 again at level 3 is totally fine for some extra damage, but for me it never made a huge difference, so I just prefer having my 2 for some extra movement speed for safety and mana sustain as early as possible. From there you max your 1, your 3, then your 2. Getting your ultimate at level 5 of course, but I skip leveling my ultimate until everything else is maxed. Only the cooldown reduces as you level it, which, yes, definitely does make a difference, but not nearly as big a difference as leveling your other abilities. So that's Chronos, definitely a tough one for beginners. He's not really difficult or anything on paper, but he requires a lot of game sense from the player to understand what positioning is safe and at what time, and requires you to plan ahead a lot more than other gods do. Or I suppose you could say, planning ahead on Chronos makes a bigger impact on the character than it does with other characters. Plus, his first and third abilities aren't always the easiest things to hit, especially against players who know the character well and will space themselves in Juku accordingly. And of course, any god who's not good in the early game, and especially ones that are easy to dive like Chronos, are pretty bad for newer players, so there's a lot of things to tell you to steer away from Chronos. With all that said though, he's a fun god with one of the highest hypercarry potentials in the game. Just don't pick him into gods with too much chase and dive potential and you're gonna hard carry just about every match with him. A lot like Vomit in that regard. That's all I have on Chronos for now. Thanks for watching.